Soup Shah is a senior software engineer at 426 Solutions, CSC company, and turn it over to Soup.
Hi, how's everybody doing? All right, so I don't do really good with speaking. Let me know if the mic's off or anything like that. I'm not very good with the speaking. So how many people here have heard of Docker, and I'm not talking about the khakis? All right, wow, a lot of you. So I guess like half the talk I don't even have to do. So my talk is actually called Dynamically Scaling Accumulo with Docker. I like to call it Docker plus Accumulo equals love. So I guess let me kind of get started with some definitions and things like that, and then we'll go off the use case a little bit. Let me tell you where I come from and what my background is, because it's actually kind of relevant to why I even bothered attempting this stuff. So I work at 426 Solutions, and we're working on the Dotus app engine. And what that is basically it's an app engine, right? And so everything is a service, right? And so one of the tricks is that we want to attempt to try to give developers database isolation. And I'll explain a little bit about that later. But that's one of the reasons why we try to look into different ways to actually build things as a service, right? Because, well, building things as a service is awesome right now. So, all right, so let's get started. So when we talk about the fundamentals of what we want to build, one of the key components to building any new fangled technology nowadays is it's got to be in the cloud, right? So why don't we have a cloud database? When we talk about cloud databases, there are two primary methods for doing this. There's a virtual machine approach, which is the cloud platform basically lets you allow to purchase a virtual machine. You get it for a limited amount of time. You can spin it up, spin it down as you want. You take care of installing everything yourself, and you get awesome database access. Then there's the new approach, like the Pivotals and people like that, and Cloudints and stuff like that, that do database as a service. In this case, you don't have to worry about spinning up virtual machines, spinning down virtual machines. In fact, everything's a service. And so you are given an API, like a REST API, and then you build against that. So you may not be able to take advantage of all the cool features a database has. So let's talk about these two. So database as a service, right? One of the major things that's awesome about these is that all users hit the same API. So I can upgrade and downgrade my database as I see fit, and you'll never know. The other thing is that administration is easier because administrators only have to know one version of the database. That's awesome. One of the major cons about it, though, is that during spikes, resources can be scarce as analytics cannot be run during heavy query times. One of the major things from my years of working on cloud software and things like that is you'll learn that as people store data, you kind of want to segregate your indexes, right? You want to have a set of indexes that are for real-time load and a set that are for analytics. Because if you try to use both, you're going to run into that problem where I'm going to try to read from both things at once, and I'm going to spike, and, well, that stinks because now my real-time users are getting pissed off, my analytic users are getting pissed off, and my tablet servers and databases are crashing left and right, and that makes everyone sad. The other approach is the Virtualized DB approach, which I talked about earlier. So basically, you get full access to the API. We're not going to hold back from anything. It's easier for the underlying database as there needs to be no new code to support that, right? So you're going to call directly into Accumulo or directly into Mongo or directly into HBase. You're going to talk into all these things with the raw API. Awesome. Nothing's getting in my way. Well, this has some cons too, right? One of the major cons is I waste resources. I'm an app, and every other app in the world is going to be like, my data is important. I have a big data problem. So therefore, I'm going to spin up, a 100-node cluster because, I have a big data problem. Well, most of the time you don't. And then the other problem is that for sysads and, and DevOps and people like that, they got to know every freaking version of database under the sun that they support because, well, I'm an app. I built my app around this one version of the database. I don't want to upgrade my stuff. So you support it. That's kind of cool. So what happens now is that we want to kind of take a hybrid approach of this, right? So we want to get the best of both worlds. And one of the major things is we want to use this via Docker. or a Linux container, right? What is a container? Basically, a container is kind of like Inception. It's Linux running Linux, right? And that just blows a lot of people's minds, especially government accreditors. So what that does, though, and this is where and I'm going to ask everyone's help in here to convince them that this is a good thing, is what this does, though, is it provides resource isolation. So what does that mean? That means that I can isolate my Linux running within Linux down to CPU, network, disk I/O, RAM. And I can even namespace things because they're in containers. Namespacing becomes trivially easy at this point. It looks like a VM from the inside of the container, so it's all about views, right? So if I'm inside the container, this looks like a full-blown operating system. I can do whatever I want. If I'm a systems administrator, though, it looks like a process. So you're causing me problems, I kill -9 you. So it's pretty awesome. So why Docker, right? What is this whole Docker thing and things like that? So Docker, basically, Docker is it's a system on top of Linux containers called LXC. And so what that does is Docker is providing me, it's basically written to be a convenience function on top of the Linux containers. And what it provides me is portable deployment across machines. And when I say portable, I also mean repeatable deployment across machines, because that is pretty important. And it makes it really simple in a config file format to actually lay out how my machine's going to get laid out, what boxes it comes from, and things like that. Docker has a built-in versioning system like Git. So I can track revisions to my boxes. The other thing that I can do is I can take snapshots of my boxes. So that is pretty awesome because I can take backups and things like that really, really easily. The other thing it has is Docker has the concept of chaining images together. For those of you who are developers or DevOps and things like that, think of it like import. I can take a secure version of a box, I import that, I manipulate it, and bam, now I have my package. So coming from a world where that's really important, I don't want to have to go through and install Java. Someone will probably have done it for me. I don't want to have to go through and install, MySQL. Someone will probably do it for me. I'll just take that and then I'll add my app in there. So it's pretty simple and it's pretty straightforward, and it makes life a lot easier. Sharing Docker containers comes easy. There's even a public repository for it. I'm going to give you that link right there. That being said, setting up a private repository, also just as easy because it's just an HTTP server hosting these boxes with a little bit of metadata on there. So if you want to host your own private internal to mess around with your own stuff, go ahead. It's pretty awesome and pretty easy. So one of the major and most concerning things with Docker, though, is the networking. Because now I have Linux within Linux. That's awesome. However, I live in a cloud world, and in a cloud world, everything has to talk to each other. So networking becomes pretty tricky. So one of the things that Docker does is there's two things when you have to consider with networking is, number one, that you have to talk between containers on the same host. And number two, you have to talk with containers across multiple hosts, right? Because we build PaaSes and things like that. So we want that to happen because we don't want to waste our resources. So to make two Docker containers talk to each other is actually relatively straightforward on the same host. There's this thing called the link command. And basically right there, you just do a Docker run. You can give your container a name, and then you can link it to another container. And that's just what I particularly wanted to run at the time. What this command is doing underneath the hood is it's creating a secure tunnel between the two containers. And yes, this is secure in the sense that the government accreditors will accredit it without having them to expose any ports to the control host system, right? So I, as a host, don't have to expose any ports to the outside world if I don't want to. It does this in two ways. Number one, it uses environment variables. How many of you are familiar with any OpenShift PaaS out there, like or OpenShift or like Cloudin or the Pivotal? Anybody familiar with those? Yeah, so there's that, and then there's the 12 app. And has anybody read the 12 app factor thing? If you haven't, I highly recommend reading the 12 app manifesto because it explains some very good things, and the number one thing is configuration. And they really believe in using environment variables. The other thing it will do is that when it builds your base image, it will update the etc host files. And it does that so that you can get access to that other container, and it learns about that. Again, this will only work on containers that are on the same host. So now we have the fun that is multi-host networking. So there are numerous ways to link Docker containers across hosts. In fact, there's another way probably being created right now. Probably one way about every hour or so, someone creates a different way of connecting Dockers across multiple hosts, because nobody's figured out a good way of doing it yet. The remote or the suggested manner on the Docker site itself is called the ambassador pattern. So how many of you guys are familiar with just basic coding and interfaces and things like that? So from a DevOps perspective, this actually adds that interface type of principle to containers. So what you do is you set up your one machine, that in turn talks to another container, which is set up to rig against a standard port. That container then in turn actually is going to be something simple like a socat or something like that, which then goes out and talks to another host. And then there's another container that's another ambassador talking to socat, another host, and then that forwards it to the underlying thing. So in this case, we're going to do it with Redis. So I have a consumer that talks to a Redis ambassador, which goes across the network, which talks to another Redis ambassador, which then in turn goes and talks to Redis. The reason that I do this is my consumer should only want to talk to a Redis thing. It shouldn't know what host my thing is on, so this way I don't have to reconfigure it. So that happens, and then if I want to move my Redis to a different machine, my consumer is only talking to the Redis ambassador. He has no idea what's going on. So I can then move and I can swap out implementations per se. So it's kind of interesting pattern. So what you really cared about is Accumulo on Docker. So this particular thing, how many of you saw Billy Rinaldi's talk? That was here just before. So this entire presentation was really inspired by Slider, which is formerly Hoya, and it allows you to spin up databases on the fly. So check out Slider. It's also inspired by a product that 426 built in-house called Badass, Big Data as a Service, which allows users to spin up their own Accumulo while sharing a global HDFS and zookeeper for their own applications. We can get into that in a little bit of why we need to have a global HDFS and zookeeper currently. And it currently allows scaling by adding more tablet servers manually. So what are the advantages of something like this? One of the big advantages is that security between data is simpler, as users literally have their own versions in between databases. So how many of you are familiar with the namespace in Accumulo 1.6? All right, that's pretty cool, and it does some really awesome stuff. It's a huge step forward. My biggest problem has been with actual people saying, hey, I want my own database. And because of that, they're like, I can't trust that this person isn't looking at my data and things like that. Even though you tell them that they have namespacing and stuff like that, they just don't trust you. So what this does is basically you have your stuff and it runs completely separate. It's on the same machine, but it's completely separate and isolated off. So nobody knows what a particular iterator is doing to a particular table or something like that. The other thing that happens is if you're monitoring from a CIO and program director perspective became really easy, because now I can see what databases are being used the most, right? I can actually physically view that stat, because now all my databases are segregated, and so I can figure out this database is being used more than this database, is being used more than that database. Yes, the Accumulo monitor gives me some look into that, but as a CIO, I want to know what programs I want to keep and what programs I want to get rid of. So I can figure that out just by looking. There are a lot of advantages. I'm just giving you all a heads up. So Docker makes it trivial to back up. Like I told you earlier, there are snapshots. And so taking a snapshot of an image is really, really simple. And then what I can do with those images is I back them up in HDFS so that I can keep those around for a long time, because most of the time my images are fairly large. And what that also does is sometimes you can even get running state captured. And so when you can capture running state, let's say that you have an Accumulo tablet which has some stuff that's come in on it, and you want to just snapshot it right there, you can actually kind of, think of it like Windows Restore. You can almost go back in time and bring your Accumulo server up to when it has stuff in memory. So it's kind of interesting that you can actually pull that off. Basically what this allows, it allows users to configure their database however they choose. So how many of you guys saw Mike Drob's talk earlier about the benchmarking and stuff like that? He was talking about tuning the knobs. This totally lets you tune the knobs and lets you play around with Accumulo so that it handles the exact way that your data is being done. Multi-tenancy is really cool, but being able to actually tweak my own Accumulo instance and make it work for what I needed to, that's kind of really cool. So, it helps me out with my data problem, kind of getting at what a lot of people were saying earlier, which is it's all about what you need to do with your data and know your problem. Then the other thing that it does is I can actually set up really simple monitoring around this, and I can figure out my peak times so that I can do things like analytics if I wanted to. I can do all sorts of crazy stuff like this. It allows me to maintain 2 different versions of the databases, and with the work on Accumulo 378, which will be coming up after this about data center replication, I could actually have a live sync between 2 databases running on the same system, which is kind of cool. And then the other thing for all my systems administrators, people in here, I can kill -9 that sucker if it's getting out of hand, and I love that. And it won't affect any other users on the system. Now, there are disadvantages too. Basically, it goes back to the virtual database thing, which is admins have to know many different versions of the database sometimes. With the HDFS permission scheme, user and group permissions become a little bit more difficult. Port allocation becomes a bit tricky, and IP tables rules become really unruly. The other thing that needs to be pushed back into Accumulo that I've got working is Accumulo right now keeps IP addresses inside of Zookeeper. So in this magical world where I have one global Zookeeper, I somehow need to figure out a way, and I've got something working, but to get host names or Docker containers and have those external names pushed to Zookeeper such that I can then retrieve and go back to where I want to go. So it gets a little bit hairy in that sense, but it's doable. So, one of the things that really helped out is that Accumulo is built to scale, right? If you saw Aaron Cordova's talk earlier, he talked about all the awesome things that Accumulo has to scale. And so one of the things, actually going back a little bit, this talk was also inspired by what Aaron did with bringing up tablet servers and killing them in AWS. So if you get a chance, read his slides, they're really good. And what it does is basically it lets me have the smarts, right? There's the load balancer built in so that the master can recognize when a tablet server dies. There's iterators are now stored in HDFS, so it becomes really super easy to deploy those things. I don't have to deploy them across machines anymore. Accumulo allows for multiple masters, which makes failover significantly better. The write-ahead log is stored in HDFS, which, while it has its problems, as anyone will tell you, it does make this particular use case a lot simpler because I can share it a lot easier. So there are a couple of future improvements that I want to do to this. I want to tie this in a slider a little bit more and allow Yarn to be the resource allocator, because any good PaaS just consists of resource allocation and then spinning up Docker containers in my mind. And basically, people are already starting to do this. There's a ticket out called Yarn 1964, where instead of using the current container system that Yarn has, which in my mind isn't that great, it switches it with Docker, which allows you to push things and make it really easy and really portable. The other thing I want to do is I actually want to feed into the JMX statistics that the Accumulo monitor is getting, because one of the things that it does really good about is it can tell me when a database is getting hit really hard with query or ingest, and that allows me to kind of do what Aaron was talking about earlier, which is spin stuff up and spin it down, so it makes it really elastic. And what would be even better about that is it's automatic. So you as a user don't have to care. Accumulo itself can basically kind of manage how it makes containers, which is kind of neat. And then we want to add container creation and deletion via Ambari or Cloudera Manager. So one of the things that it can do, or one of the things else I want to do is I want to make a GUI to make deploying containers and health monitoring of the system easier, make a GUI to view system health and to see what databases are deployed on the system, and add H-based support. None of this stuff is a product. The entire point of this talk was to actually try to convince you guys that it's really simple with Docker to build your own PaaS. You don't have to be scared anymore to attempt to go out and build PaaSes and things like that. With Docker and Yarn, you gain that ability really quickly to build a PaaS and have your apps and things like that custom deployed, custom packaged, and all sorts of good stuff. So that's really what I wanted to get around. And because my because my talk has had no pictures up until now, do we have any questions? I love talking about this stuff, so I can talk about it for another 15, 20 minutes if you want, but I'm open for questions. With Docker. So, there's no there's no user guide as of yet. I can build one, but it's going to take a little bit of time. But it still takes. I mean, it's still a little bit. The networking is the tricky bit, and coming out with a way that isn't my proprietary weird scheme that will scare people. That's something else. The other thing is, if you want to mess around with it, it might actually be a lot simpler to use GearD, which is something created by the OpenShift people. And so what that lets you do is it lets you do dynamic creation of Docker container images and stuff like that across the platform really simply. And it lets you do a lot of the networking that was painful by hand. It's called GearD. And it lets you do a lot of the networking and stuff that was painful across the multiple hosts. And it makes it really simple because you can actually lay it out in a config file. Yeah, it's just Red Hat. You have to Google for GearD, G-E-A-R-D. G-E-A-R-D. So this is something that I built in about a weekend. So it's not like an hour, but it's about a weekend's worth of work. Sans all the fancy web UIs. So sadly, one of the major defects that exists in Accumulo right now, and I'm going to put it out there and I'm going to get booed and whatnot, but it's that I need to have access to the HDFS or the Hadoop conf and stuff like that, right? I mean, we grab that all from, and that's why we have the Accumulo or Hadoop home, zookeeper home, and things like that. So that kind of stinks. And so that's why I went around the approach of having just one HDFS instance and one zookeeper instance, because this way I can get it from one place. I can map it really simply on the host systems. So there's a bunch of ways that people do things. A lot of people have tried, a couple people tried putting zookeepers on their own. A couple of people tried putting HDFS on their own. I'm kind of torn between the two because while having HDFS on their own is great, but now I've containerized something that should just be a global file system and I can't take full advantage of the underlying resources. So I, for one, am of the, if I have one gigantic instance and I use the instance.dfs to point my instance to a particular directory, if that dies, it's not so bad because I should, in theory, based on the testing talk earlier, right, I'm able to recover that pretty simply just by bringing up a brand new master container. So what you can do is you can actually, the best approach to do it is actually just look at it Accumulo way. Look at it at the processes and say, I want to have these processes run in this container. I want to have these processes run in this container. These processes run in these containers. And you can either A, create dynamic configurations on the fly, or B, you can do something and then you can map them in. Docker provides a really easy way to map them into the host platform. Or you can B, create something where, actually that's probably the best way of doing it. And then you can then spin up Accumulo. And what that does is there's really no new code added. You're just spinning it up based on configuration. The only thing that you have to do is point it dynamically to an instance ID and tweak your ports a little bit and do the port allocation. That gets a little bit, that is hairy, but there's things out there like CoreOS that make that a lot easier. Anybody else got any other questions? We got about 10 minutes left, so I can talk about this a little bit more. Performance, I saw, performance actually is a little bit better because as compared to virtualized hardware, containers are really, really wicked fast. And so I get basic, like, it's really easy to spin up and down. So performance-wise, I actually get a huge win using containers versus virtualized machines. The other thing that I forgot to talk about is, and I haven't had a look, is DockerCon just finished a couple weeks ago, or a couple days ago, sorry. And now Google has an offering that you can download off of GitHub that also does kind of what GearD does. I know that Amazon has something where you can start to upload Docker containers. I know that Azure is working on something. So let's just put it this way. Docker is the new cool thing, hence the t-shirt. So it's probably going to catch on pretty quick. They internally, for those of you who don't know, internally Google used C groups and things like that to manage containers. And they kind of had a Docker way of doing things, and that was the Borg that a lot of people have mysteriously heard about, right? I mean, it deployed things into a containerized version of Linux, and then you could mess around with it. It wasn't quite as complex and as neat as Docker, but it was, it's kind of how stuff works. And so what's neat about this and with Docker is that I can use something like Mesos. I can use something like Yarn to just basically do my resource management, and then I have my actual applications going. The reason that I like Docker over most of these other systems is that I can actually just have one cloud of machines now, right? And that's why I chose to have the HDFS approach, is I can have the one global HDFS, the one global zookeeper, because now I just have a cloud of machines, and it doesn't matter whether they're web machines or something like that. They're all running within their own container, and I can kill them off as I see fit. The greatest thing that I've found using Docker and things like that in the past has been the ability to scale up and down my web servers. So stuff that you'd pay OpenShift and all those guys a lot of money for, you can now kind of do on your own with a couple lines of code. Yep, that's correct. Sean? They could be, yeah. And you could do that really easily. It was, Sean, can you speak up a little bit? It was can the Docker containers that are running Accumulo be co-located with HDFS? I'd have to look into it. I'm not sure. In the back? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so GearD only works in Red Hat 7 because it relies on systemd. So that's its hard dependency. But Docker itself runs all the way up to CentOS. I was running it in CentOS 6.5, so Red Hat 6.5 supports this completely. All right. Is anybody up?
Did you publish any of these back to the Docker repository?
The Docker Accumulo images, not yet, because I'm still tweaking and messing around with them. So this is just my fun project that I literally saw a slider in Badass, and I was like, hey, I want to go mess around with this, and I did it in a weekend. So when I get some chance, standard open source, if I get some chance and I finish some other projects first, then I'm going to clean this up and then publish it back to the Docker repository. All right. Nobody else has any questions. Thank you very much.